Welcome to AP World History Modern Podcast. This is topic 4.4, Maritime Empires, Link Regions. Okay, the overall theme of this chapter, European nations driven largely by political, religious, and economic rivalries established new maritime empires and administered trading posts in Asia and Africa and colonies in the Americas. That's kind of the theme. Our essential question, how were the empires of European states established between 1450 to 1750? And what economic and labor systems fueled them? You should be able to answer that after you read our AMSCO text and the podcast. Please remember, the podcast is not meant to replace our reading. It's just meant to help explain our reading. Please make sure you're doing both. Okay. American plantations. At first, they relied on existing labor systems. And sometimes this gets lost. Make sure you know that. And then it's going to introduce new labor systems. But like a lot of things in history, it's going to be out of what they felt was necessity. So here's our topic. New labor systems introduced in the Americas. Our first one, indentured servitude. So an indentured servant, these were like arrangements which servants, they were contracted to work, but for a specific period of time, so many years. And then after we work, we get passage, into this new land. That was more of a trade-off. Indentured servitude was no picnic, but it wasn't as bad as slavery. Then you got chattel slavery. This is a system in which individuals are considered property. They're bought and they're sold. So there's a big difference between slavery and indentured servitude. Indentured servant, you have a contract, right? You're giving them something, you're getting something. Slavery, no deal. You are a piece of property. So the growth of the plantation economy increased the demand for slaves in the Americas. This is going to lead to a significant demographic, social, and cultural change. Okay, our next topic, state building and empire expansion. So the exploration of European states. This is the foundation of maritime empires. States are going to claim lands and they're going to establish the basis of an empire in the areas they explored. Like we talked about before, those maritime empires, you don't have to take over the entire, whether it's a country, a state. You don't have to go inland and conquer. You don't have to do like the Mongols did. If you can control the ports, mission accomplished, because now you're controlling the trade, you're controlling the money, right? And that's what it's all about. So maritime trade, little different strategy, a little smarter strategy, in my opinion. States are going to claim lands and establish the basis of an empire in the areas they explored. Okay, here's another topic. Trading posts in Africa and Asia. Certain regions of East and West Africa were the targets of European conquest during the late 15th century. European traders set up trading posts along Africa's coast. It's very important to remember. The coast of Africa. They're not invading, Africa. There's no like this massive amphibious assault to gain control. They're just setting up on the coast. Now, some of the local rulers in Africa, these are, other Africans, they start to figure out, because of geography, because of their location, they're on the coastal region. They have an opportunity here to make a lot of money for themselves. So some of the local rulers, they're trading slaves to the Europeans in exchange for, guess what? Gunpowder and cannons. This is going to give these African villages and tribes that are on the coastal region a huge advantage over their enemies. they're going to have a military advantage when battling neighboring villages. So again, the geography is coming into play here big time for these African villages on the coastal region. Not only they're making money, they're getting gunpowder, they're getting cannons, so they have this huge advantage over their enemies. Some African states actually grew wealthy by selling enslaved Africans to the Europeans. In particular, our book talks about the kingdom of Dahomey, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, sorry, Dahomey. It grew stronger because it raided other villages to enslave people and sold them to European merchants. So they're going in there and they're getting these slaves ready for the Europeans. So now the Europeans, they're kind of doing the dirty work for the Europeans. They can just pick up, right? They got a business relationship. And if you want to talk like compare and contrast, this is similar to, when Hernan Cortez comes to Mexico in 1519. If you remember from the last quiz we had, I think it was the last topic or the topic before, a major contribution to the Spanish was the cooperation they got from the other tribes. And, why would these Mexican tribes help the Spanish, a foreign invader, go after the Aztecs? Because they hated the Aztecs. They had these rivalries. They had these, warring villages, as they say. So there's some similarities here to the African coast villages working with the Europeans, and like the Tlaxcalans working with the Spanish to help defeat the Aztecs. Okay, the book goes to another topic here, Japan. Japan isn't really feeling the love as far as Christian conversion, missionaries, etc. Japan is going to ban Christian worship services in 1587. Christianity is banned. They're shutting it down, and Japan doesn't even want to interact with any foreign culture. So Japan's locking it down. For about 2 centuries, Japan is going to be partially isolated from the rest of the world, and that's the way they want it. They don't want, from their perspective, they don't want their culture, their way of living to be altered or influenced by outsiders. That's going to go on until about the mid-19th century. Now, what's going on in China? The Ming Dynasty is, they try to pull China back and just have limited trade. They had a similar, belief as Japan at this time. They also want to avoid foreigners. Many of the limits on trade were eventually reversed, and China resumed its import role in global trade. It's kind of a conflict. China kind of gave in more than Japan at this particular moment in time. It's like we want to keep our cultural beliefs. We don't want some, arrogant foreigner coming in here and telling us our ways are wrong and we need to be more like them. They looked at it as kind of insulting. Imagine somebody comes to your house and your family has, whatever culture it has, whatever religion you belong to. Imagine you have a guest in your home and they go, "Oh, you're that religion? Hey, you know what? Your religion's actually wrong. And it just so happens the religion I believe in, it's the right one." How would you feel about that person being in your home? It's kind of arrogant, condescending, didactic language, and you probably wouldn't like it either. So that's kind of the perspective here of the Chinese and the Japanese. But China's going to give in to the other end of that. The other end of that is, man, there's some opportunities to make some money here. If we do interact with foreigners, we can really make money on trade. So there was a conflict there. Culture, keeping your culture intact, but still wanting to make some money in trade. Okay. Next topic: European rivalries on 5 continents. Okay, here's the overall theme. European rivalries fueled by political, economic, and religious motives is going to shape the expansion of empires, right? It's a theme of this part in this entire chapter. Several powers are going to establish trading posts in India. The British East India Company, because it comes up a lot in history, AP World History. Make sure you're familiar with that. The British East India Company, they began a commercial relationship with the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, right? We're in India, Mughal. Portugal controlled a coastal trading post in the southwestern state of Goa. France controlled Pondicherry, a city in the southeastern state of Tamil Nadu in France. That's where France controlled it, sorry. During the mid-18th century, France and Great Britain, along with their respective allies, competed for power on 5 continents in the 7 Years' War. Remember we talked about that, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, a lot of Detroit history, the fur trade. You should have covered that, I would think, in U.S. history. Britain's victory in that war, that was 1763. This is going to drive the French out of India. The Portuguese are going to remain in India, but they're going to be driven out in the mid-20th century. And as we said before in class, what does India become? It becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire. So let's talk about the British in India. The East India Company establishes small forts on the coastal regions, okay? And they're going to focus on trade. That's where the money's at. But they're limited because of the power of the Mughal Empire. And they're not really controlling much actual territory, the EIC. But they're going to begin to expand. And like we see, with the Spanish going to Mexico, the Portuguese with maritime trade, you're going to see the British take advantage of tensions between Muslims and Hindus in India. Kind of divide and conquer. We keep seeing this, right, in all these different places. They're going to increase political power. They're going to have treaties with some local rulers. And the East India Company is going to move inland with the help of sepoys. And ultimately, Britain is going to intervene in India politically and militarily to such an extent it's going to end up controlling much of this subcontinent known as India. So they're doing, they're getting the ports, but they're also being, infiltrating their, political and military structure. Okay, and the British also set up trading posts in West Africa. And the trading posts in Africa and India and elsewhere is paving the way for globalization. Globalization is not a 20th century or 21st century term. It goes back. So you're seeing globalization. You're seeing this creation of a British Empire. Okay, next topic. Europeans in the Americas. Before the European arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century, the Aztec Empire in Mexico and the Inca Empire in South America included about 10 to 15 million people each. However, as we've covered before, what is going to significantly decrease these numbers? It's going to be European diseases. Both empires are going to collapse quickly when attacked by Spanish forces. Cortez, by 1521, is going to conquer the Aztecs for reasons we've talked about before. And he's going to establish what? He establishes New Spain. And Tenochtitlan becomes what? It becomes Mexico City. So then Pizarro, him and his crew, they attack the Inca. And they capture their ruler, Atahualpa. And Pizarro, he makes a deal with the Inca. He says, if you fill this huge room with gold, Atahualpa will be released. Atahualpa was their ruler. He'll be released unharmed. the Incas take Pizarro up on his offer, and they fill this room with gold. It's an absolute fortune. And then Pizarro kills Atahualpa. What a guy. So that's what's going on with Pizarro and the Inca. And then you get the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. Spain and Portugal divide the Americas between them. That's a big thing to understand. Spain and Portugal. Portugal rules Brazil, and Spain claims the rest of the Americas. So just in case you ever wondered, how come all these countries in South America speak Spanish, but Brazil speaks Portuguese? That's why. Spain and gold in the Americas. Okay, now originally the search for profit, we talked about this. It begins with Columbus. On his first voyage, he's convinced that gold is plentiful on Hispaniola. And what is, it's a good thing to know. What is the island of Hispaniola now? Look on a map, you should know this. It's Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But there's not really any gold in the Caribbean. And he needs to take something back of value. Right? It's going to look like the whole thing was a waste of time. So he kidnaps, abducts indigenous people, and he takes them as slaves back to Spain. So, this is why Columbus, and the fact that there's a holiday named after him, it's very controversial. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but at least be aware of the argument on both sides. It's not my job to tell you how to think, but at least get your facts straight before you make up your mind. In the early 1500s, the Spanish established a system. It's called the encomienda. Now, the Spanish crown set this up, and they divide up the American Indian labor force in order to aid the development of their mining economy under this system. A Spanish conquistador or another high level or a prominent male Spaniard, he would be the encomendero, and he was granted the labor of it'd be like X amount of Native Americans. Okay, these Native Americans belong to you. They're living in this area. And the encomendero would provide protection for these laborers from warring tribes. So they were guaranteed their protections. And he would also teach them the Catholic faith. That was nice of him. And the native laborers, they paid tributes to the encomendero in the form of gold, other precious metals. Maybe sometimes it would be something agricultural. This system was meant to be like a way to enter into a peaceful, mutually beneficial relationship with the indigenous peoples. But the system, it quickly develops, and it's essentially a system of slavery, but it's almost like slavery light, right? They're trying to sugarcoat a little bit. Don't ever misunderstand this. The Native Americans, the Indians, they're treated with absolute cruelty, and they're forced into hard labor. The Crown attempts to fix this system. They try to pass various laws throughout the century. But a lot of these encomenderos, they refused to comply to these new measures. Eventually, the encomienda system, it's replaced by the repartimental system, but it was not abolished until the late 18th century, so it lasted a while. Now, what was so important about this system, right? It's referenced in your book. It's in big bold terms. Comes up a lot. But this encomienda system, it allows for like this vast accumulation of wealth by the conquistadors and the Spanish crown. They're making money. And they're going to benefit from the discovery of gold and silver in the New World and the mining of those metals by their laborers. And this is going to just domino into widespread abuse of the indigenous peoples. One way they got out of this is kind of slick. We've seen this before in other podcasts, other chapters of our book, this theme here. But since a person of, like, if you were mixed, like Native American and Spanish, you could not be put into the encomienda system. So some of the indigenous people, we're going to intermarry here with the Europeans. So, hey, man, we're on the good list now. You know, I can't be enslaved, or, you know, maybe if I was, maybe now, at least my children and my grandchildren won't be part of this system. Also, these forced conversions to Catholicism. This is going to result in, like, it's like their history gets diluted, and, like, you know, they had a culture, they had a tribal identity, and it's going to get lost. They're going to be taken away from it. You know, whatever your religious belief is, if you have one, if your family is traditionally, you know, religious, you know, any form of religion, you know, imagine being forced to lose all that. You know, everything your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents believed in, everything you were taught as a child. You know, a total stranger comes up to you and says, yeah, that's all wrong. My religion's right. Your religion is false. You know, it's not something you'd like to hear. To this day, you know, whether for better or for worse, you know, if, again, like we talked about in class, this affects a lot of you that are, you know, in this class. You know, Japanese people speak Japanese. People in Italy, they speak Italian. People from Mexico speak Mexican? Nope, speak Spanish. People in Brazil, they speak Brazilian? No, they speak Portuguese. Okay, to gain access to gold and other resources of the Americas, encomiendos, landowners, they compelled these indigenous people to work for them in exchange for food and shelter. And this was very similar to landowners in Europe when they had serfs, right? And you had serfdom. The conquistadors would be given land by the Spanish crown for organizing all this. Then the hacienda system, this is going to arise when landowners develop agriculture on their lands. And then the king gives land and labor to Spaniards. What does the king get out of it? Right? What do you think? He gets kickbacks. Well, they don't call it kickbacks. What do they call it? They call it taxes. Right? There's a fine line. So the king is getting everything the king's doing. Everyone else is doing the work. He's getting his money off the top. It gets kicked back to him. Same story, different location, different time, right? The Spaniards, they consider the indigenous people like they're savages. So when you can dehumanize someone, when you can create a sense of otherness, it's really easy for you to treat people as such. Forced labor, abuse, neglect. It doesn't even faze you because you've created this sense of otherness. These people aren't people because they're different than you. They look different than you. They speak a different language than you. They're from a different place. It's okay to treat them like this, right? That's the danger of creating a sense of otherness. So some of this morphed into a topic. It's highlighted in our AMSCO text. Is the META system. It's MITA. It's pronounced META. colonial administrators. They institute this system. It's like around 1600, 1605 in there, and it's going to require indigenous men to perform forced labor for a set amount of time, and they're going to have to work the mines, the factories that are owned by Spanish colonials. This is going to get misused, and it's going to sound a lot better on paper than it really is, at least from the perspective of the indigenous people. And it's going to morph kind of into a system of slavery. But the way you put a bow on this thing and made it look good is that, hey, but we're going to educate them and we're going to convert them. We're saving these savages' souls. We're going to convert them to Catholicism. So we're giving them something. Yeah, we're treating them like animals, and it's forced labor, right? It's slavery. But we saved their soul because we taught them about Catholicism. What a deal. But that was the Mita system. Just a side note, what a bad deal this was for the indigenous people. You would think, right? So, okay, this sucks. I'm a slave, but they're calling it, the Mita system. Well, what if, a lot of times these poor guys would die, in this system. Well, guess what? Death doesn't absolve you from this rule, because guess what? The debt you incurred, you actually incurred debt by doing this. Your children would go work in the same mines you worked in after you died, because they inherit your debt. So now the children were in the mines, and this cycle would repeat itself. And these people, oftentimes, even the next generation, they never would find their way back home. They would die in these mines. So if you get a minute, please look at the chart on page 224 of our AMSCO text and read the types of labor in the early modern period. And just keep in mind, a lot of times it wasn't a big difference between a lot of these. Maybe some of them sounded better on paper, they had a better name, but in the reality of it, none of it was a cakewalk. And but check out that chart on page 224. It'd be good if you knew that. Okay, now let's talk about slavery. Portugal is going to be ahead of other countries regarding slavery. Portuguese trading fleets, they're going to arrive in the Congo seeking slaves. Initially, they take the enslaved Africans back to Europe to work as like domestic servants. So, you even off the domestic servant, it sounds better, but I mean, you're getting ripped from your home. You're taken to a foreign land and you're just serving other people, right? Now, historically, it's important to understand, especially, this is something you could put in a DBQ, setting up your contextualization point, for example. Slavery exists in Africa well before the Europeans seek labor for their investments in the Americas. And Europeans, they weren't even the first foreigners to seek out African labor. Arab merchants during the post-classical era, they bought enslaved people during their travels on the eastern coast of Africa. But it's the Atlantic slave trade, which is on the other side, it's on the western coast. This is going to cause the most problems for African societies and have the biggest impact. So, here's the question, why Africans? Right? I think your book actually words it just like that. There's a section in your book. Why Africans? It's a great question. there's several factors that, make Africa a target for slave raids by Europeans after 1450. Okay, slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean, it begins like towards the end of the 16th century when European conquistadors are looking for gold and silver and sugar. Plenty of land. There was all this land. But the problem was they didn't have the labor to turn a profit. Europeans, the original plan, and I think we talked about this in class, the original plan is to force the indigenous people, the people that were already there. They're here, right? And they're savages, right? According to the Europeans. And let them do the hard labor, the mining, the farming. But what happened, right? We've talked about this. The European diseases, it's going to wipe out a huge portion of their, their labor force, their forced labor force, right? The other problem they had, besides so many of them getting wiped out from disease, they know the lay of the land. This is their hood, right? This is their neighborhood. They know what's what. They know where to go. They know where they can hide. And they know how they can escape. They had social networks that could protect them. And they could easily just slide in and kind of like, blend in or camouflage themselves within the native populations. Why? Because they look like them. So you could just slide in and you'd be hard pressed if you're looking for them to go find, which one is here as a free person, which one is a runaway, forced laborer, right? Or a slave. So they keep trying. There's repeated efforts to enslave Native Americans. And it just fails time after time. Now, there was some success, but overall, their initial plan of enslaving indigenous peoples isn't working, all right, for the reasons we just discussed. Some things that they did in North America, plantation owners, they're going to recruit European indentured servants. They would come to work, like to do things like grow tobacco, but they got a much better deal. Not that, indentured servant was a cake gig, it was still tough. But they were almost, I think I can use the word, it was like contractual. Like they had a deal spelled out. They would help, say, like whatever, grow tobacco. But it's only going to be for a specific amount of time. And during that time, they're going to get room and board. But, an indentured servant had like a contractual, say like a 7-year commitment, say, right? So you get 7 years. And then guess what? You're free. So landowners didn't like this. They they had this time and money invested. And then after 7 years, they're gone. And they're going to go try to make their own money. So the landowners didn't like this indentured servitude as much. They go, we need to do better than this. We need to have something that's more profitable than this. Now, after the problems with indigenous peoples, indentured servitude wasn't giving them high enough of a profit. Now they're turning towards Africa. And you got to understand the act of capturing Africans for slavery. This is going to be incredibly difficult and violent. But, if you remember what happened in Mexico, when tribes were helping against the Aztecs, we talked about this. The African leaders along the coast, they realized that because of where they're at geographically, we can make a lot of money. So a lot of these African tribes, they invaded like these neighboring societies. A lot of them, they were rivals anyway. And just like the Tlaxcalans and the Aztecs, they're going to raid these other African villages, and they're going to bring them to the Europeans. Sometimes African rulers, they were willing to hand over like their own people from lower rungs, as the book says, of their own society. People like prisoners or prisoners of war, servants, criminals. They would enslave their own at times and sell them because they're getting paid. So the next topic, the horrors of this journey. And, reading the Amsco text, listening to a podcast does not do it justice. If probably one of the, it's one of the most evil, horrible moments of all of human history is, the African slave trade and the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade. If you get a chance, see the film Amistad. It's one of the most accurate and horrible reenactments. It's to show, just to give you an idea of how horrible this was. What a horrible experience it was for these poor people. And these Africans, they're going to get taken away from their families. They're going to be put in the holding pens in West Africa, known as barracoons, or like slave castles, and they're stuck there, like imprisoned. And then from these holding pens, the slave traders would cram them like in the dark cargo section of a ship. They had very little water, very little food, and they could barely move. It was really just a horrible thing to do to these people, and horrible experience. And this grueling journey across the Atlantic, this is known as the Middle Passage. Make sure you're familiar with that. It's a big old bold term in the book, because it was in the middle part of the captive's journey, the Middle Passage. During the journey to the Americas, which it usually took about 6 weeks, up to half of the ship's captives would die. I remember I read somewhere sharks would follow a slave ship because they knew they were going to eat. It's one of the most horrible moments of all of human history. Over the hundreds of years of the Atlantic slave trade, like from the early 1500s to the mid-19th century, 10 to 15% of all African captives perished before reaching the Americas. That's overall. But you did have instances where half of them would not make the journey for multiple reasons. The exportation of enslaved people that was required to keep the population continuing in the country of captivity caused a century-long decline in population in African home countries. So this is a major effect, right? A major change in Africa. In addition to the physical migration, slavery resulted in a migration of status from free person to enslaved, setting up social classes that remained influential in post-slavery countries. And then the last topic in the book talks about the Indian Ocean slave trade. So if you look at a map, we've talked about the Indian Ocean before. So now we're right the west coast of Africa, southern coast of India. While most Africans who were enslaved and transported to the Americas came from West and Central Africa, there was a long-running slave trade in the eastern part of the continent. Slaves from Eastern Africa were sold to buyers in Northern Africa, the Middle East, and India. Many were transported to the islands off the southwest coast of Africa, such as Madagascar. The trade reached its peak in the 18th and 19th centuries. So that are the topics that are discussed in 4.4 from our AMSCO text. Please visit my website. Videos and visuals are awesome as far as learning the geography of this stuff, to look at a map. So there's a bunch of good teachers throughout the country making good videos on these same topics. And I've kind of curated some of my favorites on my website. So go to videos, go to 4.4, and take a look. It'll show you some of, the routes and some of the places we were talking about. Okay, I will see you in topic 4.5.